Good morning, everybody. My name is Carol Pepper. Kamil and Homsi and I are very happy to be with you today and to talk about the future of everything, the positive future of everything, things that are coming down the pike that are going to change your life, your grandchildren's lives, your great-grand's lives forever. The city skyscraper, skyline's going to look different. Everything's going to be different, but in a positive way. And family offices are very much known for being on the cutting edge, for being first into new trends. So that's where you make the most money. And that's what we're going to start talking about today. Kamil?
Good morning, everyone. Kamil Homsi, the GRC Investment Group. We are a single family office from Dubai with a global mandate. We focus on alternatives and specifically on commercial real estate, heavy on renewable energy, on research, development, implementation, and on waste management. And that's what ties myself and also Carol to this topic. We made a similar presentation almost a month ago in New York, and we had 2 standing ovations. So I reached out to Marty, and I said to Marty, I would love to also share this with your audience. There is so much spoken about decarbonization and about zero economies with many terminologies. If you go online and you look at the glossary of decarbonization and net zero economies, you will see pages after pages, starting from the carbon footprint to emission to capture to offset regular credits, and how to trade it, who are the brokers, what are the markets, what is the best tool for families and also for general investors to invest in. So today, we're going to try in the next 45 minutes, and is it 45 minutes or an hour?
Yes, 45 minutes, yes.
Beautiful. To share with you as much as we can, and then our plan is to maybe webcast this and make that a regular conversation where we can share with the public a lot about this. I really like to start by saying that when today the term ESG became a household, and the first letter E did not fall in the beginning by random position, because when we have environment, we can have people living, we can have them breathing air, drinking water, and eating food. All that is tied to the decarbonization of the economy. Carol, what's your thought on this?
Yes. Well, first of all, my background, I have for the last 22 years had a company called Pepper International, and I have worked with single family offices all over the world, either setting them up or improving them or acting as an external CIO. And in the last couple of years, I've seen a tremendous interest in coming onto the radar of all the families around the world, this concept of decarbonization and measuring the greenhouse gases of your operations. In the beginning, this started with a nice to have and a voluntary type of a situation, but it's rapidly moving, as we'll hear today, toward a compliance-based issue. Just to give you an example, in December of 22, the European Union passed the carbon border adjustment tax, which means if you import goods, any of your family companies are importing goods into the European Union, you're going to be required to disclose and measure how much carbon or greenhouse gas was used to create the goods. So if you're Samsung making a television, if you're a steel company, if you're a mining company, you're going to have to measure these things and report them or pay a huge carbon tax. So we've gone from lofty thoughts and wouldn't it be nice to some very serious regulations. Now, this started to get very, very serious in around 2016, where most of the world signed the Paris Agreement. You may recall that the US exited and then rejoined the Paris Agreement. And now the SEC here is also putting forth rules that will cause, for example, portfolio managers to start reporting on the greenhouse gas emissions of the securities that they invest in. So for family offices, why should you care? You should care first and foremost because this is a compliance issue that will affect your portfolios and will also affect your businesses. Of course, more importantly, the reason the world is doing this is because there is scientific proof of global warming. This is no longer a myth, despite what certain people in the United States say. They're the only people on the planet, by the way, that think this is a myth. And in the rest of the world, they are miles and miles and miles ahead, particularly, Kamil, I would say in the Middle East, where you're from. Companies that I've spoken to, for example, the largest real estate developer in the world, in Abu Dhabi, rather, called Aldar, has the most amazing greenhouse gas and net zero plan online because they're a public company with very specific metrics that they're holding themselves to actually create a net zero real estate company. So it's a very interesting time. And here, I think in the United States, we're a little bit behind the times. We're not as familiar with what's going on in the rest of the world. But step outside of this country for a minute, and you'll see what's happening. And for once, the rest of the world is going to lead the US in this particular area. Kamil?
The Europeans and the rest of the world are ahead because they have collectively engaged the government in regulation and incentives, the corporations in understanding their footprint, how to measure it, and how to reduce, how to purchase credits, and also to completely eliminate the carbon emission from their operations, from the operations that they produce or from those that they purchase through electricity, utility, transportation, and so on. And then lastly is till now there is absence of regulation. It is the Wild West when it comes to regulating offset credits and also the carbon credits, in certifying them, in giving them ratings for their age, and also for retiring them, because you can't just be someone that have a project that recapture and reduce the production of carbon, and that particular credit is good forever. It has also a vintage. It has an age, just like you buy wine. At one point, wine get better, but the offset credits, they get worse. They get depleted, and then they are no longer exchangeable in the market.
Yeah, let's get a little basic vocabulary in 2 minutes on what is a carbon credit and how you make one, so you guys understand. Of course, our buddies and all of us on the street are very eager to trade these new financial securities, these carbon credits, but you have to make them before you trade them. So there are two basic carbon markets. We're not going to talk much about the mandatory market. That's where utilities trade their cap and trade. So every year in Europe, for example, a utility is given a certain amount of tons of carbon they're allowed to emit. That's called their cap. If they go above their cap, they have to trade with someone below a cap. And every year the cap is getting lowered. So it's forcing all the utilities in Europe to slowly decarbonize. Now, what's interesting about that is the price. The price per ton of carbon, and again, one carbon credit equals 1 ton of carbon removed or avoided emitted into the atmosphere. So the price of carbon in the mandatory utility market, which is the regulated market today, is about $100 a ton of carbon. Okay, the voluntary markets, they're only called voluntary because, as Kamil said, right now they're not regulated, but I'm telling you, regulation is coming. It's where corporations trade. Now, corporations have not been yet regulated to purchase carbon credits. But as you know, many corporations are out there saying, I'm going to be net zero by 2050. I'm going to reduce my carbon footprint by such and such of a year. So those people are measuring their amount of greenhouse gas. There are scientific standards for that their operations are emitting. They're supposed to reduce the carbon emitted in the operation. When they can't reduce any further, like an airline, they have to go out and buy an offset ton for ton. So if after everything is done, my airline is still emitting 100 tons of carbon, I have to go out and buy 100 tons of carbon credits, so 1-to-1, or offsets. Now, the difference between credits and offsets is really no difference. People tend to say carbon credits when they're talking about forestry, coastline projects, et cetera, and they tend to say offsets when they're talking about renewable energy credits, capping oil wells, and things like that, more industrial things. But in truth, it's the same measurement. So you can sort of use the term interchangeably. Okay, so that's where the two markets are. Now, how do we make the carbon credit to sell to the corporation that has to buy it for tax reasons? And how are those markets trading? Well, those markets are trading at a fraction because they're not yet regulated. So they're trading around, can be as low as $1 a ton, can be as high as $10 or $20 a ton. The forestry projects tend to be much higher right now than the industrial projects. However, with the requirements, when McKinsey and all the big firms, Bloomberg, World Bank, look at the demand coming up, they're quite sure that by 2030, the voluntary carbon credits are going to be trading at $100 a ton or more. Why? Supply and demand imbalance. There'll be much more demand from the corporations than there are supply of credits from the market. So let's just take a forest. How do we make this carbon credit? I have a forest, it's sitting there. Many families do. I measure how much carbon does a forest capture naturally? Let's just say it captures 2 tons of carbon per acre. If I can improve the way I manage that forest and I now capture 4 tons an acre, I've created a 2-ton carbon credit. In other words, I've improved above the baseline by 2 tons. So now if I have 100,000 acres, I have 200,000 carbon credits that I can create. How do I do that? I follow the rules of a protocol. A protocol tells you what to do to measure that carbon. It gets independently verified. And then the carbon credit can be issued by a carbon registry. And then it goes into the trading world, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, that all sounds pretty straightforward, except there's only one large carbon registry today that's issued 1 billion credits. It's called Vera. And that registry has a 2 to 6 year waiting line. You have to get on a queue to get your credits issued. And the biggest project developers have a 1 to 2 year waiting line to even get the project started. So there's this massive queue lining up to actually get the credits issued. And that's why, again, that's going to drive up the price because the supply is very far below the demand. But once the project is certified and out there, you can then, as Kamil said, like a vineyard, every year reissue your credits, except, again, because Vera is so backed up, we have a waiting list to reissue the next year's vintages. So we're talking about a market where you've got this fire hose of projects coming into this little straw that can't quite absorb it. That's where we are today. And more disturbingly is in January of this year, The Guardian and some nonprofits came out with a huge expose on Vera saying that actually 90% of their credits were fake. Now, that was not good for the market. So they're being forced to recant. They're being forced to rewrite the protocols to make them more scientific. For that reason, by the way, I am creating a carbon credit new registry and new project development. So anyone who wants to learn about how we can make an alternative, that's not the focus of today, but that's my passion, is to get this market moving with a brand new registry and brand new credit development. But having said that, that's basically how we make the carbon credit. So now, Kamil, you want to talk about how you trade the carbon credits?
I like to also share with the audience here and virtual that we are, as much as we are entrepreneurs and business people, we are also realists. Over-regulating is going to scare a lot of companies from investing and from adhering to the regulations. There is always a pushback. I remember recently I opened a conversation by saying I live by the rule of the 4 C's. 1 C is for COVID, how COVID impacted our life and how we invest and how we operate. And then the second C is capital. We show how the capital changes, the cost of capital today that the gentleman before spoke about, and we all have those exchanges about refinancing that is happening and possible recessions and everything else. The third C is the climate, which is this conversation, and the last C that is critical, it is conflict. He spoke about the conflict. I don't think there will be a war, but all that muscle flexing, it's escalation. United States and China are no longer reliant on semiconductors purchased from Taiwan by mid-2025, according to both governments. So I don't think this is going to happen. I think we will live moving forward into bifurcated financial world. So that's one thing. Second thing, there is also a progression in the net zero economies. How is it? I remember times when for ESG, companies had to obtain a B certificate. The B certificate was supplied or was provided by a private entity until government stepped forward. And today, like for example, in the United States now, we have a new entity that was passed a few years back that's called the Benefit Corporation. And that Benefit Corporation replaced in general up to, I think today we have 47 states that recognize the Benefit Corporation. So I can, to replace that B certificate, but the B certificate had also a like 200-300 check marks that we had to meet in order to qualify. The Benefit Corporation is very similar to LLC, but you have to commit from registration that your investments will be pro ESG and also pro the environment. Excuse me. In the absence again of it today, trade is creating conflicts. There is carbon credits litigation. I'm sure the attorneys here can just address us on this and share. And also we have brokers. So there is a secondary market for it that someone is worth looking at. But there is pushback. When there is conflict or when there is pushback headwind from the wars, from the economy, then ESG and the environment fall from the front seat to the second and the third seat today. That's a concern. We see the Europeans going back to fossil fuel, going back to coal. Many of them are not adhering to the sanctions. And we know that for a long time already, from 2-3 weeks after the war started. That include Austria, include Holland, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic. They can't afford to buy from elsewhere. So they're going back to fossil fuel, going back to coal. And this is alarming for the movement that we all are here today listening to this.
Yeah.
Yes, Marty.
Are there multiple exchanges or is there one central exchange?
Yes, Marty asked, are there multiple exchanges? So there are 14 voluntary registries around the world, but as I mentioned, the only one of substance and size is Vera. That's the one that's traded the most credits. And there are multiple exchanges. That's the next step is once you've created the credits, how are you going to trade them? So you could trade them on an exchange. You can have a contract directly with a corporation that wants your credits. Many of the world's largest corporations are running around locking up the best projects for 30 years. So they're going to get all the vintages of credits. Despite the war, this is still going on, by the way, or the potential threat of war. Or there are funds now being set up where people are buying credits to hoard them, waiting for that $100 price to sell them. So we've got some speculation going on. The exchanges are interesting because one exchange is called Expansive Capital. That's the one that's backed by Blackstone. What they're doing is basically creating a mortgage-backed security, except it's a carbon-backed security. So they're creating synthetic securities backed by a pool of carbon credits. The same for Air Carbon, which is the one in Abu Dhabi. The one that I like, that I work with, is in London. It's run by a guy named Wayne Sharp, and that's the Carbon Trade Exchange. Now, that's the exchange, the largest exchange that trades project-level credits. Now, I believe eventually it's just like the hedge funds. If you guys remember, in the early days, people bought fund of funds because they didn't understand what they were. Then they bought individual hedge funds. Then eventually they went in and bought, seeded a manager. And I think the same thing will happen here. Some people are buying these, carbon-backed securities today because they get a pool. But of course, the pool is only as good as the underlying credits, and that's where the problems lie. And then you can go to the Carbon Trade Exchange and buy actual project level credits. At least there you get visibility about the relative trading values of the different credits. So for example, as I mentioned, forestry credits, replacing a forest, can trade at $20, $30, $40 a ton, whereas, old renewable energy projects, as Kamil mentioned, the older the vintage, the less attractive the credit, trade for, 50 cents, $1, $2 a ton. Some people just want to buy a ton of cheap credits to fulfill their carbon emissions goals. Others, big corporations want nice, beautiful projects that are helping the forests and the gorillas and whatever, and they'll buy them more expensive credits. And people are creating portfolios, some cheap credits, some expensive credits, et cetera. Think of the early days of Bitcoin, the early days of the internet. There was a lot of experimentation, a lot of things cratered, and then other things emerged. The big key for carbon right now is the measurement of carbon. Are you actually doing something? And that's the bit where the challenges lie, the scientific measurement of the carbon credit integrity. The good news is the militaries all over the world actually are releasing a lot of their satellite and drone technology for commercial licensing. And what's happening is you can now buy really great satellite imagery or soil sensors or mini mass spectrometers on drones that were initially only available to military. They're now being made available commercially at a reasonable price. So that's why I believe in a couple of years, the accuracy and concern issues of fake credits are going to go away because we're actually getting the science now to actually measure. Both in Portugal, for example, the European military has released a lot of technology here. I'm working with a scientist who's out of Los Alamos, and he has a license to commercialize some really good stuff. Yes?
Question from the audience.
Sure.
Well, online, give me a second here. Question is whether to recognize different flavors of carbon. Some that come with a stock of other benefits, like carbon going into soil, improves water management, drought productivity, things like that.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the essence of the carbon credit is removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Okay, there are a lot of people trying to tack on other things, co-benefits, meaning more diversity, protecting local villages, et cetera. Those co-benefits tend to increase the value of the credit. Unfortunately, it's very hard to judge one project against another. So that's the other thing that's developing as we get more projects to look at. There's going to be, I think, more normalization over the next couple of years of how much are those co-benefits worth. I do believe they will be worth more if you have a project with good co-benefits than if you don't. But it's right now, even if you look across, say, 2 or 3 wind projects in different countries, the credits will trade at different prices per ton. So it's think the 80s when you could buy a bond in Europe and sell it in New York the same day, the same bond, just on a different exchange, and you get a different price. That's where we're at. It's a very primitive market, mostly traded over the counter or private contracts. So that's where the opportunities are. You can make a lot of money in markets like that, and eventually it will become much more like a stock market, highly regulated. As Kamil said, though, of course, that does tend to kill some of the innovation, but it will come. Because it's going to be a huge market, they will regulate it. The CFTC in the States and a similar body in Europe.
I also like to add that we're talking about carbon dioxide only when it comes to the carbon credit.
Or methane put into a similar calculation.
Yeah, so I know these are the early days. My question was, how liquid are these spreads, getting all the spreads on these different carbon credits? Are they narrow? Are they wide?
Extremely wide. The question is how narrow or wide are the bid offer spreads on carbon credits now? They're extremely wide. Okay, so that's why you can make a lot of money. That's why most of the money is being made by brokers who scoop up these credits and sell them to each other, or some hapless corporation who pays a lot more than the broker did. But there's a lot of money to be. People are making a boatload trading today, over the counter.
Are there hedge funds that are focused on this?
Starting to, yes. In Europe, there's starting to be hedge funds focused on this.
How is the system gonna manage the accountability to the registries that are creating the protocols? Because I think that's where that spread is so wide. Because you have
I think, as I said, today there are 14 voluntary registries. Each registry has its own set of protocols, so you can kind of game the system and shop around and figure out what registry you want to go to. But the players are pretty savvy. They know that different registries are worth different, prices. I think eventually all registries are going to be regulated by a equivalent of a CFTC or somebody like that in Europe.
But the private projects are paying for the development of the protocol. So that's like one hand covering the other. It's like
it's a very cozy little system right now. In fact, right now, the poor landowner, just to tell you something egregious about how greedy the carbon credit markets are today, the poor landowner ends up with about 10 or 20% of the credits at the end of the day, because the project developer takes a chunk, the verifier takes a chunk, the broker takes a chunk. That will also go down. That's another reason I'm creating a new registry, because I think it's egregious. And I think you would have a stampede of projects if you just gave people more money and were a little bit less greedy.
But that's a lot more transparent when you're talking about a forest. But go to the industrial piece. In the industrial, the person that's developing the technology, the project, or the owner of the plant, they are the ones leading the process that's being protocoled by the registry, right? So who's gonna be able to judge that that is done the right way or not?
Well, currently, for example, if you take the oil and gas protocol, let's just take capping oil wells as an example. The first protocol to be put out in the world was on the American Carbon Registry. It was backed by a foundation, by one of the Rockefeller foundations named after Winthrop Rockefeller. And that foundation worked with all the leading scientists in the world. Your answer, his question is sort of who makes sure the protocols are acceptable. And currently, everybody has different ways that they do it. For example, with that industrial protocol, they went to the top oil and gas scientists in the world. Obviously, Rockefellers have access to them, and they got the best people in the world that they perceived could judge it, to say this is how you should measure that you are not allowing the methane to release into the air. This is a very important carbon credit, by the way. Today, there are over 3 million uncapped oil wells in this country, most of them from bankrupt companies that are sitting around spewing methane into the air, the equivalent of about 2 million cars on the road. So just getting money, but there's never been any money to cap and clean up a lot of these old oil wells. Just by creating a protocol and making it easier to cap having money available to cap the old oil wells, we're going to clean up a big problem. There's over 30 million of these wells globally. So that's an example of an industrial where the protocols tend to be coming from top scientists, hopefully. But I also think it's going to go further to like the EPA and the ISO standards globally. And that's where it has to go. It has to go to the global standard. ISO is the international standards organization that most of the rest of the world follows. That is, where we're going with our registry. You've got to have top scientific minds. And it will keep changing, by the way, because the technologies are getting different. There's the opportunity for new types of credit. We've heard about green hydrogen, et cetera. Somebody has to write a protocol for each of those new types of carbon capture and then turn it into a credit. So it's really about gathering the best scientific minds in the world. And those guys, interestingly, are not very profit driven. They truly are scientists. They care about the science.
The short answer is we need government to step in and to regulate, and so to train auditors, and for those auditors to be out in the field, just like in every other economic sector where there is an oversight. Today, most of those industrialists, and we do own different companies that produce products, and we do emit to the atmosphere, we do purchase carbon credits. And today, this will be for your question. My opinion has to be government regulated at the end of the day. But it always starts, like I mentioned, the B certificate and the benefit corporation. It starts from the public. There is an outcry. There is a new generation that's pushing in that direction. Then there is COVID that also kind of accelerated our concerns about the environment, about the air and the water and the food production, and all that is kind of creating among those 535 people in Washington plus few others. I don't know how much they know about the topic, but again, it's a wake-up call. It takes time, just like everything else. But I also like to mention, I'm looking across from me. I'm seeing high rises. Studies show that 40% of the emission to the atmosphere is produced by real estate. And 70% of that is produced by construction material. And the other 30% is by operations. So knowing that all those gateway cities with all these high rises, commercial real estate all over, if it is industrial or residential or otherwise, also is subject to purchase those carbon credits. Adding to what Carol said also, many property owners, because no one is monitoring their carbon footprint, they estimate it to satisfy their investors, satisfy their staff, and also the public. They are over purchasing it at a discounted price, and then they are reselling it for profit. And the best example, Elon Musk, Tesla, sold last year $600 million of carbon offsets to the market, because not claiming that this is what the technology allow him to do, because for every ton that he is not producing by using his batteries, he is creating a carbon credit. And he was among the leading sellers of the country.
And I think another thing that's happening with real estate, and again, any of you who want to see a great model, look on the aldar.com website, ALDAR. I just love this company. It's a public company in Abu Dhabi. They make billions, $20 billion. Their profit was up 30% last year. Really respectable, interesting company. But you can download their net zero plan. It's right there. It's a public company. This is all online. And what's happening is when commercial real estate developers start looking deeply into this, and as Kamil said, they notice how the materials affect their carbon footprint, then they start to select more green materials. For example, cement. Let's just take concrete and cement. There are lots of technologies out there today that are creating green or net zero concrete. Concrete's one of the emitters. So when you make the concrete differently, you can actually start absorbing carbon with the building can actually become a carbon absorber as opposed to a carbon emitter. So that's an example where people are running around the world saying, okay, let's find that cool little technology company that can make green concrete, invest in that and go sell them to the Middle East, because at least over there, they're looking for that type of technology. So there's a lot of really wonderful innovations that are coming from the science side into all types of industry to reduce the input of to reduce the carbon being emitted by the various inputs into things like real estate. Also, obviously, you can put better sensors in your building so that you can better control temperatures. There are new technologies coming out in the Middle East, for example, to control the sand that gets into the filters and then makes the air conditioners work harder. So there you can get really granular in terms of how can you improve your commercial real estate building so that it's a less of an emitting problem, and then you have to buy fewer credits.
Sorry, quick question. So what's the total volume of carbon credits right now?
Well, it's relatively low. So over the first 10 years of life, Vera issued approximately 1 billion credits. Okay, 1 billion. Yeah, 1 billion. However, half of those never got sold because they weren't very good. So it's relatively tiny. Now that's over 10 years. There's estimates out there that we're going to need 1 billion credits a year, which is over 10 years. So again, the amount being produced is a tiny drop relative to what everybody is being expected per regulation to actually purchase. That's why there's such a massive supply and demand imbalance. That's where you can make a lot of money.
Greenwashing is a topic that always come up when you talk about the environment, investing in the environment, decarbonization. And the greenwashing doesn't come normally from the little guys. The state of Louisiana kicked out 2 leading companies. One of them is called Exxon. You probably heard of it. And the other one is called BlackRock. Another company, maybe you heard of it, out of the state of Louisiana because of greenwashing. Both of them came investing into projects and dedicating hundreds of millions of dollars into the projects for the state regulators. Ironically, come from Louisiana. I don't know why, but people of Louisiana were not happy with the false claims that those globally leading companies have claimed at the beginning of those projects, and that happened early in this year. So greenwashing is definitely a concern today. Again, it's in the absence of regulation. You cannot run, just like we need a constitution and we need a tax code and everything else, we do need, for the decarbonization of the economy, we need regulations.
And they are coming. And I would also add that younger consumers, certainly age 30 and under, are completely focused on this. So for example, if you can find this online, look at LG or Samsung's net zero plans. They're going to be, when you go in the future and buy I think it's within 2 years, when you go buy into a television, you're going to see on that television the greenhouse gas emission that happened in order to create that television. And believe me, younger consumers are going to choose the models that have the lowest carbon emission. So the consumer markets are also going to get involved with this as they get the information on all the goods and products that they receive, how much carbon is emitted with this car versus that car. It's not just the electricity, it's the making of the car, the components of the car. So, there are people that fantasize when you get a coffee mug, you'll be able to know exactly how that coffee mug was made. So these things are coming because the science is there to do it. And that's going to drive consumer behavior in the future. So again, yes, we're terrified right now about war, but try to think 5 years out, 10 years out. Where could you have been the guy who funded Amazon when he said he was going to sell books online? And everybody thought he was crazy. I've heard more stories recently about people who either turned down Bezos or gave him a little bit of money. In fact, it was McKinsey. That was the story I heard. Bezos went to McKinsey and said, gee, I can't afford to pay all your fees. Can I pay half the fees in stock? And they said yes. And so they made $2 billion on a $2 million fee give back to Amazon. So again, don't just let fear close your mind to something right now that is right in front of you, that's a burgeoning market where you could make real money in the future.
I have more questions from the audience.
Sure.
If you want to.
I just want to add for the audience that we have this is an uphill battle. We still have to address the airline, our regular transportation, the expectations of the electric vehicle, the faulty batteries, and safe technologies on the battery, on the recycling of the batteries, and where today even the Tesla batteries, only 37% of it is recyclable, and the rest will go to the landfill. Thank you very much. Now we still need that, and then we have the maritime shipping, the cruises, and also the container ships that run on two types of diesel. One cleaner than the other, but both of them are dirty for the environment. One they use in the international water, which is the lower grade, and one when they cross the 12 miles toward a port to load and unload. So that the emission of that is again at the extreme, but all these services or industries that we all involved in, can you imagine yourself flying in an electric airplane? I mean, I rather walk. Take me some time on a bicycle, maybe.
But some people are working on creating biofuels for planes and ships. It's coming. It's coming.
And the storage of it and the safety, especially
Yeah.
on liquid hydrogen.
It's absolutely early days. You're absolutely right.
Still in nascent stage. Marty, you said something?
Yeah, I've got 3 questions here. So I think that you guys addressed the whole Biden tailpipe thing at this point, right? So they're asking about what about methane exchanges for agriculture? For example, like pig farms and things like that. And also a nitrous oxide exchange.
Are there exchanges for these things?
They're asking if that's going to be.
There could be. I mean, look, it will be up to somebody to go out and create one. What's happening, for example, as I mentioned with the oil capping as an example, you can trade that, which is really the release of methane. There's a formula that converts that into carbon equivalent, and you trade that as a carbon credit. So probably some of these things, because hard enough to get one regulated market, it's going to be harder to create 2 or 3 new ones on top of that. So probably what they'll do is they'll make a scientific calculation about how you convert those things. So with the pig farms, for example, you want to put the manure somewhere where the gas won't be just leaking into the air. That kind of thing, and then capture that gas and then do something with it, maybe use it for fuel. It's called waste to energy. There are credits for that today. And in all cases, the protocol tells you exactly what the scientific formula is that you have to use.
Marty, there are 2 other exchanges that cover the methane. One is called NORI, N-O-R-I, and one is called Native. So
yeah, it's interesting. Some of these exchanges, by the way, are not issuing carbon credits like NORI. They're issuing tokens. So there's a bunch of kids out there, young people that are trying to tokenize carbon credits and sell them because then they can fractionalize them and sell them to the general public. Whereas the corporations buy the whole carbon credit, a ton of carbon, which can be a lot more money. So, it's the real question becomes DeFi in carbon land. For example, Mark Cuban created something called KlimaDAO a few years ago, which was supposed to buy carbon credits, fractionalize them, retire them, and then trade the tokens around. It completely crashed and burned. Why? Because the underlying carbon credits were very, very poor quality. So when people finally got into looking at the underlying carbon credit, the whole thing fell apart. He lost a lot of money, as did the investors. So, tokenization of anything is fine as long as we know, as long as the underlying asset is good. So that's why I keep saying, look at the quality of the carbon credit and how are they measuring that. That's going to be the key to the whole market really taking off at the scale that we need.
So another question is, so the article in the Wall Street Journal last week about China and India, now they're equal to 1/3 of the world's population, but they have faced challenges with decarbonization,
Actually, they're working on it. I mean, for example, there's another piece that we haven't gotten into here. So let me just briefly mention it. By the Paris Accord, every country in the world is required to measure the carbon spewing into the air from the country. So a country level measurement, and you're supposed to create carbon credits inside the country to first offset the country's emissions. So, and then whatever's left over, you're going to be able to trade globally. That's not the case today, but that's definitely where everything is going within the next couple of years. Now, I'm also on the board of the United Nations Capital Development Fund, UNCDF, and I can tell you for a fact at COP, the countries are wandering around going, we don't have a registry, we don't know how to do this. But big countries like India and China have created internal carbon markets. And in fact, India came out recently and said they're not going to allow any Indian carbon to go out of the country and be sold globally until they meet the country's requirements. So they're trying to follow what the UN has mandated. China actually is doing a lot on decarbonizing. So India and China are on it. They're on this. So that's the other level, is how, they keep pushing the deadlines back because there hasn't been a good alternative to offer all these countries to help them meet this requirement. So being the UN, they keep pushing, give them a couple more years. So we'll see when the country regulations come into effect. But yes, those big economies, India in particular, they have a lot of pollution, but they have a lot of agriculture. They have a lot of natural resources where they can make carbon, and they are starting to work on it. A lot of scientists in both China and India, of course. It's very scientific and engineering countries.
Since the Paris Agreement that was initiated in 2016 and then approved by the United States and the United Nations in 2017, and the two main beneficiaries of the funding that goes into the Paris Agreement are actually India and China. But ironically, since 2016, China and India added close to 400 factories that are fired by coal. And China till today is the largest importer of coal. China take the iron ore of Australia. They take of Indonesia, of Russia, and of Mongolia. Those are the main suppliers of China. China buy coal and stock it, and if someone say you cannot use, they have enough. So that is also an issue, and that ties again to greenwashing. Carol, what I want to ask you also, I know Marty gave us the 5 minutes sign. Everything that we're talking about, how is it going to benefit the future generations that we are raising, mentoring to succeed us in running our families?
Yes, I would say the rise in global teenage suicide has been severely linked to climate despair. Climate despair is now a thing. What we don't know, because we're all busy working, is that children are watching TikTok videos, YouTube videos that show an apocalypse of our planet. Many children believe today, including children of wealthy families, believe that there will be no grandchildren. A lot of them are not having kids. You know how we have the drop in birth rate? They're saying, I don't want to have children and have them suffer through the death of the planet. I mean, they literally believe this planet is going to be a dead wasteland apocalypse. And for this reason, they are suiciding and they're not having children, because we have not given them any hope that we can fix this planet. Meanwhile, we know that there is hope. We know that people are working on this. And I personally don't believe the planet is going to be a dead apocalypse, assuming Russia doesn't drop a bomb. So for that reason, we have to communicate that to them. We have to tell them and show them. That's another thing that I'm doing with my company. We're going to do Netflix videos and TikToks and show kids, the adults are not asleep at the switch here. We are doing something, and that they can go to school and study, be climate scientists if they want, and get involved and do projects. So I think it's very, very important to get rid of this despair that they have it's very real to them. This is talk to your kids and your grandkids and ask them what if they really think they're going to be able to have grandchildren, and you might be shocked with what they say. What about you, Kamil? What do you see with I know you're very close to your grandsons. So tell us about those conversations you have with the boys.
Thank God I have 5 grandchildren. And I mean, I used to love soccer and traveling the world. Today, they stole my heart, and that's all I love. So, talking about the future of what they're watching, lucky us, we watch Mario Brothers. They're not going to see that anymore. So definitely there is concern that I hear in our regular quarterly meetings in Dubai, where we have in the main table, we have the 7 of us who are the investment committee. And then we have around the wall 2 lines. We have the candidates to replace us, and then the second generation, arming them all with tablets because they know I'm going to quiz them after and ask them for the minutes. Were you watching, or you were playing games, or you were writing your girlfriend or your boyfriend? So the conversation always come up, and they know that since 2014, I have developed an overarching policy where all our investments, the conversation of ESG is factored in it. And for those fund managers here in the States or abroad that we invest in, and there are multiple, they know that this will be constantly brought up in every meeting, not only about the initial meeting when I talk about what do you think of ESG, what do you, the portfolio companies that are under your umbrella, how do they recognize this? I demand deeper due diligence. Do you constantly contact HR about diversity, about equal pay, men and women, about maternity, about women not only on the board of advisors? I want women on every level of the corporation. And I tell them, look, I'm not from here. I'm not running for an office. But if you want to do diversity and equality, you have to do it all the way. So the new generations, I don't do it to appease them because it also satisfies me. But I see that these are the main questions that they bring up in every meeting about our global investments.
Well, I think that says it all. I think Kamil gives us a fantastic example of what families can and should be doing with their next generations. And I really think if you want to be a visionary investor, take some of your money and start to wade into this, because you'll be very glad. You could be like the person who funded Bezos when everyone thought he was crazy. Now is the time. It's not too late. We're going to fix the planet. It's not going to blow up.